How did a single day of fighting turn a planned breakthrough into a sudden dead end, and why did it happen in Pokrovsk of all places? In the space of hours, during a bitter winter push, a concentrated assault aimed at cracking the Donetsk defensive belt stalled and then collapsed, leaving behind burned equipment, broken formations, and a silence that spoke louder than any announcement. Pokrovsk, a logistical hinge and urban gateway, became a killing zone, not because of overwhelming numbers, but because preparation met patience and mass met precision. The assault unfolded against the backdrop of a broader winter campaign, one designed to press advantages before weather and politics reshaped the battlefield calendar. Russian units surged toward the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration, with repeated storming attempts, betting that pressure and persistence would finally force a rupture. Streets, industrial blocks, and rail-adjacent neighborhoods were probed in rapid succession. The tempo was meant to overwhelm defenders and compress decision-making. Instead, it exposed the attackers' assumptions. Urban terrain punished predictability. Narrow approaches, overlapping fields of observation, and pre-registered fire turned momentum into liability. What made this moment distinct was not merely the repulse of attacks, but the way the defense unfolded. Ukrainian forces treated the city as a system, not a set of isolated positions. Movement corridors were controlled, entry points were monitored, and reserves were fed in with restraint rather than haste. The defense emphasized timing over spectacle. Small units held ground just long enough to draw attackers into exposed zones, where fires could be masked without revealing intent too early. The result was a sequence of engagements that felt disconnected to the attacker, but formed a coherent pattern to the defender. Winter amplified the consequences. Cold slowed recovery, strained vehicles, and increased consumption at the very moment when supply margins were thinnest. Any delay or misstep cascaded. Assault elements arriving late found supporting fires out of sync. Units pushed forward without adequate reconnaissance, only to discover that routes thought to be permissive were already under observation. In an environment where minutes mattered, the attackers lost hours. In a city where meters mattered, they lost blocks. The shock reverberated beyond the streets. Pokrovsk sits astride key movement and sustainment routes, making it more than a symbolic target. A failure here does not simply pause and advance. It reshapes operational planning across adjacent sectors. Commanders are forced to reallocate resources, reconsider timelines, and accept that the defensive line they hope to fracture remains intact. That recalibration carries political weight as well, because winter offensives are meant to demonstrate inevitability. When they fail publicly and decisively, the narrative shifts. Equally important was what did not happen. There was no dramatic countercharge, no reckless pursuit. The defense remained disciplined, denying the attacker an opportunity to frame the engagement as a temporary setback. Losses accumulated quietly, then all at once, when concentrated formations met prepared fires. By the time the scale of the failure became clear, options were limited. Pull back and regroup, or press forward into an environment that had already proven hostile. This opening shock at Pokrovsk set the tone for everything that followed. It revealed a contest not of brute force, but of systems, how information, timing, and restraint can defeat mass. As the smoke cleared and the cold set in, the question lingered: if a heavily prepared urban defense could turn an offensive surge into a standstill so quickly here, what would that mean for similar assaults planned elsewhere along the line? Why did an assault doctrine built on pressure and persistence unravel so quickly once it reached dense urban ground? The answer lies in the gap between expectation and reality. The attacking plan leaned heavily on a familiar formula: repeated infantry pushes, supported by drones, artillery, and short-cycle replenishment. designed to grind defenders down through exhaustion. In open terrain, this approach can impose constant stress. Inside cities like Pokrovsk, it becomes a trap. Urban combat compresses space and magnifies friction. Streets channel movement, buildings block line of sight, and verticality complicates command and control. The doctrine assumed that drone coverage would compensate for these challenges, providing continuous reconnaissance and rapid targeting for artillery. That assumption proved fragile. Urban clutter degraded signals, shortened engagement ranges, and created blind spots that could be exploited by defenders who understood the terrain intimately. Massed infantry assaults also struggled with timing. Units rotated forward in waves meant to maintain pressure, but the density of the environment slowed movement and created congestion. Entry points became predictable. Once identified, they were monitored and shaped. Defenders did not need to contest every approach. They needed only to control enough of them to force attackers into narrow funnels where advantages evaporated. Each failed push increased fatigue and reduced cohesion, making the next attempt less effective than the last. The reliance on centralized coordination further compounded the problem. Urban fighting rewards decentralization and initiative, yet the assault doctrine depended on tight synchronization between reconnaissance fires and maneuver. When that synchronization slipped, even briefly, assaults lost their edge. Artillery arrived late or struck empty positions. Infantry advanced without adequate suppression. Small delays became decisive failures when defenders were prepared to exploit them. Equipment choices reflected the same mismatch. Vehicles struggled to maneuver in tight streets, and their presence drew immediate attention. Once immobilized or damaged, they became obstacles rather than assets. Dismounted troops faced overlapping defensive fires that punished exposure. The environment favored those who could wait, observe, and strike at moments of advantage rather than those who relied on continuous motion. Winter conditions intensified these effects. Cold reduced endurance, increased maintenance demands, and narrowed windows for action. Units pushed forward under pressure found themselves operating at the edge of their limits, with little room to recover between engagements. In such conditions, doctrine that assumes relentless tempo falters. The defender, by contrast, could choose when to engage, conserving energy and resources, while forcing the attacker to expend both. The failure was not merely tactical, but conceptual. Urban terrain negated the advantages of mass without offering compensatory benefits. Persistence turned into predictability. Pressure turned into exposure. Each attempt to force a breakthrough revealed more about the attacker's methods, allowing defenders to adapt in real time. What was meant to be an attritional grind became a series of costly repetitions. This mismatch raises broader questions about adaptability. Assault doctrines developed for open or semi-open terrain cannot simply be transplanted into dense urban environments without modification. Cities demand patience, intelligence-led maneuver, and a willingness to accept slower progress. When those elements are absent, losses mount quickly, as the fighting around Pokrovsk demonstrated. The gap between doctrine and environment can be as lethal as any weapon. If urban battlefields continue to dominate key axes of advance, how quickly can assault strategies evolve to meet realities that punish repetition and reward restraint? What happens when an army loses its eyes in the middle of a fight? And why did that moment arrive so abruptly around Pokrovsk? The answer lies in a deliberate shift in defensive priorities. Rather than treating unmanned aircraft as disposable nuisances, Ukrainian planners focused on the human systems behind them. The battlefield emphasis moved from shooting drones out of the sky to dismantling the networks that made them effective. This recalibration produced effects that rippled across every layer of combat. Drone warfare depends on continuity. Operators must observe, communicate, adjust fires, and relay information in near real time. Break any link in that chain, and the advantage collapses. Around Pokrovsk, defensive units identified patterns in launch sites, control points, and operator behavior. These were not random guesses, but conclusions drawn from repeated observation. Once patterns were mapped, responses followed with discipline. Precision fires targeted locations where operators congregated, rested, or rotated, rather than chasing individual aircraft across the sky. The impact was immediate. Reconnaissance gaps appeared where constant surveillance had once existed. Artillery units accustomed to real-time correction suddenly fired with reduced confidence. Infantry advanced without the reassurance of overhead observation, increasing hesitation and slowing tempo. In urban terrain, where visibility is already limited, the loss of drone guidance proved crippling. The environment magnified the damage, turning temporary blindness into persistent uncertainty. This approach also altered the economics of the fight. Training drone operators takes time and resources. Losing crews is not equivalent to losing hardware that can be replaced relatively quickly. Each eliminated team represented months of investment erased in moments. Over time, replacements became less experienced, less coordinated, and more risk-averse. The cumulative effect was a steady degradation rather than a dramatic collapse, but one that steadily shifted the balance. The psychological dimension was just as important. Operators who felt targeted adjusted their behavior, reducing exposure and limiting flight time. Caution replaced aggression. Missions were aborted earlier, and coverage gaps widened. This hesitation cascaded through the system. Commanders received less reliable information. Artillery response times increased. Infantry units advanced with incomplete situational awareness. In a fight where seconds mattered, these delays proved costly. Urban combat sharpened these effects further. Buildings interfered with signals, forcing operators to position themselves closer to the front or at predictable vantage points. That proximity increased vulnerability. Once identified, these nodes became focal points for defensive action. The city itself became an ally, masking movements and enabling precision strikes against exposed control sites. The success of this strategy underscored a broader lesson about modern warfare. Superiority does not require dominance in every domain. It requires dominance at decisive points. By focusing on the human element behind technological systems, defenders turned an apparent disadvantage into leverage. The battlefield narrative shifted from one of constant aerial pressure to one of contested and unreliable observation. As drone warfare continues to evolve, this episode raises critical questions. If the effectiveness of unmanned systems hinges so heavily on trained operators and secure control nodes, how resilient are these capabilities under sustained pressure, and what happens when future battles make the skies even more crowded and contested? How does momentum vanish in a modern battle, and why did it break so suddenly near Pokrovsk? The answer came in the form of a carefully timed strike that punished concentration at the worst possible moment. As assault units regrouped and gathered for another push, believing the pressure of numbers would finally tip the balance, the battlefield turned unforgiving. What followed was not chaos, but precision applied at scale, where patience and timing transformed a buildup into a liability. Concentration is both necessary and dangerous in high-intensity warfare. Forces must assemble to generate combat power, yet those assemblies are fleeting windows of vulnerability. Around Pokrovsk, defenders watched these windows closely. Movement patterns revealed when units were staging rather than maneuvering. Vehicles clustered personnel, tightened formations, and preparatory routines repeated. The environment offered few places to hide such activity, especially when weather and terrain funneled movement into predictable areas. The response was shaped by an understanding of effects rather than spectacle. Rocket artillery was chosen not for dramatic impact, but for coverage and speed. When the strike came, it did not seek pinpoint precision on individual vehicles. It aimed to saturate the space where forces had compressed themselves. The result was immediate disruption. Units meant to move forward were scattered before orders could be executed. Equipment intended to support the next phase was damaged or abandoned. Command timelines unraveled. This moment mattered because it struck at the heart of the offensive cycle. Momentum relies on rhythm, assemble, advance, exploit. By breaking that rhythm at the assembly stage, defenders forced a reset under fire. Survivors faced the dilemma of whether to regroup in an exposed area or withdraw and concede initiative. Either choice favored the defense. Time was lost, confidence shaken, and plans rewritten under pressure. The psychological shock amplified the physical damage. Soldiers preparing for an attack expect resistance ahead, not devastation before the fight begins. When losses occur before contact, trust in planning erodes. Units become hesitant, spacing increases, and coordination suffers. Even those not directly hit feel the effect as reports filter through. Momentum once lost is difficult to regain, especially in urban terrain where every delay strengthens the defender. Winter conditions deepened the impact. Cold restricted movement and recovery, making rapid reassembly difficult. Damaged equipment was harder to repair, and exposure increased fatigue. What might have been a temporary setback in warmer conditions became a prolonged pause. During that pause, defenders adjusted positions, reinforced key points, and prepared for the next attempt, widening the gap between effort and result. This episode also highlighted the importance of intelligence discipline. The strike succeeded because defenders waited. There was no rush to engage prematurely. Patience allowed patterns to emerge and ensured that when fires were committed, they achieved maximum effect. In contrast, the attacking side paid the price for predictability, repeating routines that became liabilities once observed. Beyond the immediate tactical outcome, the ambush reshaped operational thinking. It forced a reconsideration of how and where forces could safely mass. It reduced willingness to assemble in strength, pushing attacks towards smaller, less decisive probes. Over time, this shift diluted offensive power and transferred initiative to the defense. As modern battlefields grow more transparent and responsive, the lesson from this moment is stark. Concentration without concealment invites disaster, and momentum built on routine can shatter in seconds. If assembling forces has become as dangerous as advancing them, how will future offensives generate the mass needed to break prepared defenses without exposing themselves to the same fate? When numbers begin to dominate headlines, the deeper question shifts from scale to sustainability. Around Pokrovsk and across adjacent sectors, losses accumulated not as isolated incidents, but as a pattern that forced uncomfortable arithmetic. Personnel, equipment, and time became currencies spent faster than they could be replenished. The battlefield narrative was no longer about gaining ground, but about whether the current pace could be maintained without hollowing out future capability. Attrition is not merely a count of casualties. It is the erosion of capacity. Units absorb losses unevenly, and replacements rarely arrive with the same experience or cohesion as those they replace. As winter operations intensified, the gap between reported strength and effective strength widened. Formations nominally intact on paper operated with thinner margins, rotating fewer rested troops into the line and stretching command elements across wider fronts. This thinning reduced flexibility precisely when adaptability was most needed. Equipment losses compounded the problem. Urban combat accelerates wear damage and destruction. Vehicles exposed in confined spaces are harder to recover, and damaged systems often remain where they fall. Over time, repair backlogs grow. Spare parts become scarce. Crews improvise, cannibalizing disabled equipment to keep others running. This approach sustains short-term operations but undermines long-term readiness. Each workaround borrows against the future. The tempo of operations magnified these effects. High-intensity engagements compress decision cycles and shorten recovery windows. Units pushed forward with minimal pause found themselves returning to contact before fully regrouping. Fatigue accumulated. Maintenance slipped. Small inefficiencies multiplied into significant constraints. In this environment, even modest disruptions carried outsized consequences. A delayed resupply or a missed rotation could cascade into operational paralysis. Manpower pressures added another layer of strain. As losses mounted, the cost of maintaining force levels increased. Financial incentives rose, reflecting the difficulty of recruitment under sustained combat conditions. Training pipelines struggled to keep pace, producing replacements who required time to integrate. This lag created a mismatch between operational demands and available skill-reducing effectiveness, even when numbers appeared sufficient. The sustainability question extended beyond the immediate front. Resources devoted to maintaining pressure in one sector limited options elsewhere. Commanders faced trade-offs between reinforcing stalled axes and preserving reserves for future contingencies. Each decision carried risk. Reinforce too aggressively and risk exhaustion. Hold back and concede initiative. The margin for error narrowed with every engagement. These dynamics contrasted sharply with the defensive posture. Defenders benefited from shorter supply lines, interior positions, and the ability to choose when and where to engage. Attrition favored the side that could impose costs while controlling exposure. Over time, this asymmetry shaped outcomes more decisively than individual battles. The accumulation of losses also influenced strategic messaging. Claims of progress became harder to reconcile with visible damage and slowed advances. The gap between expectations and reality widened, complicating planning and morale. Sustaining an offensive narrative under such conditions required increasingly optimistic assumptions, which in turn increased the risk of miscalculation. As the winter fighting dragged on, the arithmetic grew unforgiving. Attrition is patient. It does not require dramatic breakthroughs to be decisive. It only requires consistency. If current loss rates persist, the question is not whether pressure can be maintained tomorrow, but whether the system can endure another season of the same demands without sacrificing its ability to fight effectively in the future. How long can any force sustain high-intensity urban combat when every gain costs more than it replaces? What happened around Pokrovsk resonates far beyond a single urban battlefield because it exposes patterns that will shape how future wars are planned and fought. At its core, this episode underscored the decisive role of systems rather than symbols. Firepower mattered, but integration mattered more. Information, logistics, morale, and timing converged to determine outcomes, and weaknesses in any one of these areas proved contagious across the entire force. For Western militaries observing closely, the lesson is not that urban defense guarantees success, but that resilience and adaptability can neutralize numerical pressure. The fighting showed how layered defenses, disciplined reserve use, and selective engagement can blunt assaults designed to overwhelm through repetition. It also highlighted the value of prioritizing effects over spectacle. By targeting the mechanisms that enable an opponent to fight, reconnaissance, coordination, and sustainment defenders can impose costs that compound over time, rather than dissipate after a single clash. the implications extend to alliance planning. High-intensity conflict between technologically capable forces will stress assumptions about speed and dominance. Urban centers, logistics hubs, and information networks are likely to become focal points. Protecting these assets at home and abroad requires closer coordination between military and civilian authorities, as well as investment in redundancy and rapid recovery. The notion of a safe rear is increasingly outdated. This battle also reinforces the importance of human capital in a technologically saturated environment. Advanced systems amplify capability, but they depend on trained operators and cohesive units. When those human links are disrupted, technological advantages erode quickly. Preparing forces for this reality means emphasizing training resilience and decentralization alongside hardware procurement. Strategically, Pokrovsk illustrates how attrition can favor the side that controls exposure and tempo. By choosing when to fight and when to wait, defenders shifted the burden of action onto the attacker who paid for every attempt. Over time, this dynamic reshapes campaigns. Offensives become cautious probes, replace pushes, and initiative drifts toward those who can impose costs without overcommitting. The broader geopolitical context adds weight to these observations. As global tensions persist across multiple theaters, the ability to learn and adapt quickly becomes a strategic asset. Conflicts are unlikely to remain isolated. Lessons transfer, doctrines evolve, and missteps are studied closely by potential adversaries. The patterns revealed here will inform planning far beyond the region. Ultimately, the events around Pokrovsk suggest that future victories will be less about dramatic breakthroughs and more about sustained advantage. Wars may be decided by who can integrate intelligence, protect critical systems, and manage attrition over time without exhausting their own capacity. If that is the emerging reality, how should modern militaries rethink offensive ambition, alliance coordination, and the balance between speed and sustainability in conflicts yet to come?